All right, everybody, we're going to get started. I want to say hello. Apologies for the delay. Um, there's, as always with these streams, there's something. There's always a technical difficulty. We found a new one. We learned something yet again for Twitch this week. But I want to, without any further delay, welcome our very esteemed guest this week, Mr. Ben Speight, who is an organizer with the Animation Guild and the IATSE. He is my mentor and partner working on organizing folks and games, and I'm incredibly excited to have him here. So, hi, Ben.
Hey, Chrissy. Good to be with you, as always.
Yeah, you want to, I gave you a little intro. You want to say a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I'm proud to serve this tremendous organization, the IATSC. We've been making great strides in our organizing and animation across the United States, and continue to do so. And we have led now two successful campaigns in visual effects. And as Chrissy has shared on this stream at Working Man Interactive, and Novemi was here last week, so it's great to be in this space talking to game workers and allies. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, where I've been organizing for most of my adult life in different crafts. My craft is organizing, and I'm here to talk a little bit about strikes and the power that it holds for workers, and some of the things that we can prepare for as we organize in the games industry.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Ben. I'm so excited to have you. Um, so, we're talking about strikes this week. Big topic in the news. Um, Hot labor summer with everybody on strike. It felt like UPS, the Unite Here folks are still on strike. SAG-AFTRA is still on strike. There was the big WGA strike. Um, so Ben, maybe we can elaborate a bit more. But like, what exactly is a strike?
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty fundamental first question. I think that that's a good place to start, Chrissy. A strike in its traditional and even modern form is the mass withdrawal of labor by a workforce, either in a single workplace or across an entire company or across an entire industry or across an entire labor market. It's like a city, or even beyond. And strikes have an ancient origin, probably going back to the first week of that people were ever providing their labor for some form of compensation. There was talk of a strike, and it certainly has carried forth to the modern era. And it's something that, one, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, we certainly are seeing a resurgence of strikes across many of the major labor unions, and a desire to learn more about them and their power by many non-union workers across many sectors of the economy, both here in the U.S. and throughout the world. So a strike is a decision made by a group of workers to say that we're not going to provide our labor until we have our demands met around the return of our labor. And that looks very different in very different settings and different historical contexts. But essentially, that's the tactic: is that we're not going to put our bodies and our lives on the line until we have a resolution to our demands. So it is labor's ultimate weapon, and one that we should both cherish and defend and understand its power.
Absolutely. Um, I feel like with all the talk of strikes lately, a lot of people get conflicting information about it, like who it affects and all the folks that get put out of work and all that stuff. But recognizing that strikes are how we make long-term wins as opposed to focusing on the short-term losses is really important, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously great sacrifice that is borne by the workers who go on strike for whether it's a day or a month or 100 days or however long it takes. There is a lot of concern and anxiety about losing even any income as a result of going on strike. And so a strike is, by definition, a sacrifice on behalf of the workers that are making that decision, and one that no group of workers I've ever seen takes it lightly. I mean, it is taken, that decision is not only has to be voted on democratically within most, if not all, unions to authorize a strike, but one that people would only really be willing to take unless they felt like they've exhausted all other means to address and to their priorities and to achieve their goals and bargaining and with their employer. But to your point about a long-term gain from it, what a strike, if run successfully, and it was done, with the leadership of the workers that are involved themselves directly in every stage of that process to get to it and carry out the strike, if done successfully, it can reorder the power dynamics and relationships in the workplace and across an entire industry. And it could also be a catalyst for workers who are currently non-union to be inspired by the success of a strike, in any organizing victory, to replicate those gains elsewhere. And that's what we have seen. When workers stand up in one sector of the economy, they inspire many, many more who are observing that. Courage is contagious, and we have seen that whether it's with public teachers, and what comes to mind is the West Virginia teachers, I believe, in 2017, and the United the School District of LA and the teachers there, who also were prepared and struck, and the Chicago teachers. There was something that they obviously learned from one another, where they can successfully make historic gains in their profession, even in the public sector, despite efforts to cut, education resources for their classrooms. Successful strikes inspire others, and but ultimately, there are a lot of other different forms of collective action, as I mentioned, that should be developed and carry out prior to the strike. But as we have saw recently with the Writers Guild, that there are great gains that can be made if members are willing to show that kind of level of solidarity.
Um, on the topic of collective action, um, strikes are one form of it, but what are other examples of things that workers can do collectively? And when we say collective action, we're talking about you and your coworkers coming together and taking action. So kind of self-explanatory there, but what are some other ways that workers could use their collective force to make change at the workplace that aren't strikes?
Well, look, there's a lot of good resources out there nowadays about escalating forms of collective action, and I think that folks should seek to educate themselves and their respective coworkers, to go beyond what I can share here. And but suffice to say that in each workplace, whether somebody is a game developer or an animation artist or a VFX production worker, or in any other sector of the economy, the people that do the work every day know that work process. They know the pipeline, they know the production process, and they, by having that knowledge of the work process itself, are the most aware of the vulnerabilities of the employer in carrying out the daily demands to create that business and to generate the profit off that collective labor of those workers. And so, if we were to ask what is the best tactic, one of the questions that we would ask is, how can we ensure that those that are directly impacted by these issues, namely the workers themselves, are capable of carrying out a certain tactic, willing to carry out a certain tactic, and that their input, their insight about the workplace itself is reflected in whatever tactic that may be deployed. And so that initially often takes the form of very low risk, high participation forms of collective action, symbolic, perhaps, or visual forms of solidarity like buttons and Zoom backgrounds, union T-shirts, other ways of demonstrating public support for your campaign in the workplace. Externally, externally facing public actions like public petitions, social media campaigns, collective actions outside of the workplace, including demonstrations and informational pickets. Um, you know, Obviously engagement with a broader set of community allies that are connected back to that workforce. Doing public shows of solidarity with other movements and campaigns to build a broader network of allies. All of those are very important steps that could or may not be taken by every campaign, but uh, have often been emphasized as forms of public pressure on the employer that if they raise issues in the workplace itself, namely the desire to improve wages, benefits, and working conditions, and overall have a voice on the job, then those collective actions are all protected concerted activity. It's the term under the National Labor Relations Act that gives us the right to free association in the workplace. As long as we're advocating for changes to, again, wages, benefits, and working conditions, and other things that impact us as workers on this particular job, then there's a lot of creative tactics that we can deploy. What's most important, though, is that the strike, unlike all those other tactics, absolutely requires maximum participation to be effective, and those tactics do too. Just like in an organizing campaign, we set a benchmark of a very high threshold of a supermajority of 80% or beyond of confirmed support. When you get to the question of any form of these collective actions, it's very important that we have an incredible level of unity across every department and work group for those tactics to be successful. And really, it's only after many of those tactics have been exhausted that people feel like a strike is even appropriate. It is important for a worker-led series of escalating collective actions to take place throughout the organizing effort and throughout the effort to win a first or successor contracts, so that when the question of a strike comes up, it seems like a natural next step, not one that is premature or that we're rushing into because we only know one tactic, which is what the bosses accuse us of.
Right. Um, that was awesome. I learned a lot right there. I'm always learning a lot from Ben, and I'm so thankful for all of his insights on so many things. But um, another thing that I wanted to ask you while we were here is talking about what what is a strike and what is not a strike. So what are some things that people might misconstrue a strike to be?
Well, a strike is not um, an act of protest outside of the workplace itself. So people confuse or correlate, pickets, which is, essentially a mobile protest outside of the entrance of a workplace or facility, um, as a strike. And you can have a picket without a strike. Most strikes have pickets, but they're not the same. A picket is a visual representation of the workplace, of the workers' dispute outside of the workplace. Um, a strike is the purpose of a strike is to disrupt the ability of the employer to carry out productive activities in the same workplace that those workers have been working. And so if we're not disrupting the ability to make a profit at that particular facility or at that company in a mass way, meaning a supermajority of the people that create that profit no longer are at work, then it's not a strike. It's another form of protest. And I know that maybe some folks that are watching may have a disagreement, that you can have a minority strike. My opinion about minority strikes, or of a subset of the overall workforce going on strike and protest, is that it's dangerous, and that it could put those workers at risk if they don't have the support. And it will put those workers at risk unless they have an overwhelming support from the rest of their coworkers to join them. So again, a strike is, shutting down the ability of the employer to operate. And of course, there are many ways within the law and this current broken federal labor law system that we have
Mhm.
that empower employers to undermine strikes, and that do restrict the right to strike. And the right to strike has been attacked um, since its origins, when all of union activity was considered an illegal economic conspiracy. We finally were legalized after generations of struggling in this country just to have the right to negotiate. But the right to strike has been one that has been feared by employers since the first work stoppage in history and to this day. So they're always going to find ways to get around it and to try to limit it and restrict it. But it is fundamental to our current labor law system too. That the right to strike is enshrined in the National Labor Relations Act. It's considered protected by the United States Constitution. It's certainly protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's enshrined in most industrial societies around the world as a fundamental human right. Um, so we should look at utilizing it more often, but also make sure that when we utilize it, it works. So we have to have the right plan to back it up.
Um, would a walkout be considered a minority strike, or would that just be a protest?
A walkout can be considered a strike if people don't return back to work until they have meet some resolution. And typically people describe a walkout during a more finite period of time, like during a lunch break, or around emergency safety issues. And those have the same level of protection as an open-ended strike, where people are not returning back to work until they've reached a broader set of resolutions. So there can be a form of short-term strike that is in response to immediate urgent conditions. But still, the challenge for the workers is how to sustain that, how to actually, beyond the emotional response of an event, how do we actually capture and win the demands that will ensure that those issues don't continue to reoccur. Um, but yes, to answer your question, walkouts can be a form of strikes. They can also be a form of protest and without disruption to work.
Right on. Good to know. Um, because I feel like, especially in the games community, we've heard a lot of talk about walkouts, especially with the better ABK folks. Um, so it's definitely something that directly relates to the folks that we're talking about. Um, but I think that one of the major concerns about people going on strike are people who go on strike losing their jobs either to like outsourcing, or somebody, or like a fresh student getting out of school and taking over their position. Can you talk a little bit more about what a strike breaker is, and who typically are those people?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question to ask again, because employers are going to, you know, as soon as a union is formed, they're going to use strikes as both a threat that it's inevitable that workers are going to strike, and certainly are almost their fear of it themselves as employers is almost to the level of paranoia. They think that strikes are always going to happen if you have a union, and that they would have little ability to combat that other than seeking to replace either permanently on a short-term basis the striking workforce with non-union workers. And the history of the use of non-union workers or replacements or strike breakers or more pejoratively scabs is tragic because um, the ultimate example of employers pitting workers against one another. And history has shown that employers specifically target and recruit the most vulnerable sector of the working class, those that have the highest levels of unemployment and are the most precarious in terms of their income and stability, economic stability. So whether it's workers that have been locked out of the job market because of discrimination, including workers of color, immigrant workers, workers from other regions, that they will move into certain areas to be strike breakers. And it is the constant threat. They assume, though, incorrectly, that the employers, that is, that opportunity to recruit strike breakers is always present, because it's not. In certain contexts, in certain historical periods, and in certain industries, there's not an army of unemployed workers waiting to take your jobs or able to take your jobs. They don't have the skills to do some work that's being performed by workers who are on strike. They're not just readily available to come in and do your work, and not at the numbers that the employer needs, and not at the skill levels that employers need. And employers don't have an open-ended right to replace workers who are on strike. Now that the ability of employers to use strike breakers has been expanded over the 80 plus years of the National Labor Relations Act. And obviously before, it was, completely up to them to truck in strike breakers and arm them with, guns and batons and baseball bats and other, tools of violence to attack union workers on strike. And that's the history of violence on strike lines, is that of employers with the help of the police and the state to attack workers who are exercising their freedom to withhold their labor. But still, in that environment, it's hard not to see those that are going in taking that work as the enemy. In fact, they're just pawns of the employers, and they're sent in there often without much information, and they're sent in there in a very dangerous environment. They're often paid more than the workers who are on strike. And they're often, given the same poor working conditions and unsafe, treatment that the workers who are on strike are fighting to improve. However, the use of strike breakers isn't unlimited, and if you are on an economic strike, which is a strike for money or improving benefits and working conditions, then the right to strike is much more limited, because if you're striking for money, the National Labor Relations Act permits employers to replace you if they can. It's hard to replace people who do certain types of work, and it's hard to replace them in quickly. That's why most strikes are not economic strikes. Unless, again, like the writers and actors, they reached a determination that there's not a massive pool of actors and writers that do what they do that can replace them at the numbers that they represent in the industry. And they're right. That hasn't been the case at the actors and writers strikes. But most strikes actually declare protect and achieve protection under the National Labor Relations Act, because they're engaging in that strike because the employer has been accused of or has been found guilty of committing a violation of federal labor law, the National Labor Relations Act, which constitutes what's called an unfair labor practice. And when an employer has committed an unfair labor practice, workers have a right to strike without being permanently replaced. They can be replaced on a short-term basis, but nobody can permanently take their jobs. Okay. And so it's important that we, again, assess the legal terrain in which a strike may be needed. And we should access the fullest protection under the law for any group of workers to engage in that action, so that when a strike is concluded, it's resolved by people coming back to work now with their demands being met, and with the people that were doing their work while they were absent, or they're on the picket line, I should say, going back to where they previously are from, and that would be a resolution that would be a just one in that instance. Um, there's other restrictions on strikes that I can get into, Chrissy. As you know, I can kind of go off about things, so I'll try to stay on message with it. But there are obviously restrictions, and if not prohibitions, for public sector workers, including at the state and local levels, but certainly at the federal level. Those have been issues that have continued to need to be addressed since before and after the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike. That 1,300 black men and others went on strike in Memphis, Tennessee, where Dr. King was cut down by an assassin's bullet. That strike was an illegal strike. It was not permitted under state law, but those workers just took that action to demand their fundamental dignity as human beings. And because of the work that they did and the sheer number of the workforce, the city of Memphis had a hard time getting trash picked up during that strike, which was ultimately successful. Likewise, the strike by the West Virginia teachers was illegal, and they shut down the school districts in every county in the state of West Virginia, and ultimately prevailed in winning the wage gains and, I believe, the improvements to the healthcare system that they were seeking for so long. So there is risk with strikes, and employers have a lot of advantages of trying to maintain and continue production. And that's why a picket line is set up. And that's why broader community support is generated to discourage conducting business or patronizing or consuming products of a company that is actively facing an active picket line and strike. So the picket lines often restrict access to and from the facility itself. So if you look at the UAW strike against the big three automakers, you can see that they were slowing down trucks entry to and from the auto parts facilities and the other manufacturing plants that they had set up picket lines at. And that slowed the production process too, even though the companies tried as best they could to continue some form of production.
Um, questions in the chat. Evil Death Crab, glad to see you here as always. Evil Death Crab asks, when we did the ABK walkout, there was language around the length of the walkout to be no more than a day, and the number of times you could walk out for any given reason. And I think that number was either 1 or 3. I guess my question is, what are the differences between striking with a union versus striking while unorganized? What do you think, Ben?
Well, it's really about the capacity and the resources to go beyond an initial outburst of protest, and to sustain a longer struggle that actually is able to capture and then implement tangible wins. So, rather than an act of resistance that is fueled by outrage in the short term, what comes out of having a union support you, and really any other advanced level of organization, the workers themselves, is how can we actually implement our gains and that they don't get taken away. Otherwise, we should be prepared to strike every week if necessary, and that's hard to sustain. In many unions, there are strike funds set up by and for the members to be able to provide forms of economic support. Other unions, they're not strike funds, but they're broad community allies and solidarity resources available. So it's in my view, without a doubt, it's critical that workers have the maximum amount of support and resources available so that they can focus on being on the picket line and shutting down production, while many others in the organization can rally around them and make sure that their basic needs and those of their families are taken care of.
The follow-up question to that is, what are some of the protected striking activities that are available to non-unionized workers?
Non-unionized workers have the same protections as unionized workers under federal law. It's all considered protected concerted activity under the National Labor Relations Act. It's really about your strategic goals of what are you seeking to win. Again, I mean, the reason why we have existing organizations like the IETSC for over 100 years, and I know we're going to get into this in one of our future Twitch streams, is that we have been able to withstand the ebbs and flows of different economic and social events and push back from a certain employer and absorb that because we are a standing organization ready to fight at any time. But ultimately, whether you strike as a part of a massive bargaining unit like those that are working in the film industry covered by the basic agreement, thousands of workers, or you're a group of 10 workers at a workplace all by yourself and dealing with the owner who's on site, your rights are the same. There are examples of worker protests that are not protected activity, protected concerted activity. One example would be if you were to protest for issues that aren't directly related to your employment. So if you were to engage in a political protest for something that was happening in your state legislature, for instance, or to protest war, for instance, or to protest or to walk off the job in solidarity with another group of workers in another industry. Political protests and what's called a solidarity strike, or political strikes and solidarity strikes, are outlawed under federal law, and have been restricted, and for a reason. They don't want workers to have a broader awareness of what's going on in our economy, and certainly to act on the job in conjunction with that view and those values and those interests. So in order to engage in protected concerted activity, a group of workers, more than two, so the minimum is two people.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this is a question about power and leverage. So even if two people did it, they may be protected in the same way as everybody in the workplace, but they just wouldn't have the same power to win.
Absolutely. Just before we move on to that next question, I wanted to mention that I did look it up. I found out, Ben. I did my research.
Okay.
The IA requires 75% yes votes to move forward with a strike authorization vote, and we could talk a little bit more about what a strike authorization vote is. But generally, a strike authorization vote is the workers saying, yes, we are willing to go on strike over whatever issue is currently at stake. But that doesn't necessarily mean that a strike is going to happen. And we talked about this when we had the stream about the SAG-AFTRA strike and the WGA strike. And we were also talking about SAG's strike authorization vote for the video game companies, which they have yet to go fully on strike, even though the strike authorization vote was enough to put them on strike, but they haven't called for it yet.
Right.
So just having a strike authorization vote, yes, does not necessarily mean that your strike is imminently happening or even will happen. So I'm going to butcher this name. I'm going to do my best, but X-Lay, X-Twitch asks, I have a question regarding the walkouts. Is there a time frame / code to follow when it comes to companies wanting to negotiate? Is there a time frame that is more advantageous to the strikers versus the company? The only example I can think of is an animation company failing to be recognized as union striking in Chicago, and retaliation was met to the organizers. They were fired due to the longer time request of the company to come to negotiations. I'm a little confused by that. Sorry, hold on. Let me try to. I was reading it and
I
thinking,
think I
like, wait,
follow a good bit of that, but yeah, go,
yeah. Um,
can restate it.
are you asking if there's like a time frame that, like, if we go on strike, there's a period of time that we have to negotiate in? Like, um, I think maybe just if you could reword your question, um, that would be really helpful. Um, I apologize that I just don't understand.
No,
Sorry.
I mean, I can riff a little bit off that, Chrissy, and just
Okay.
say, well, you don't win every fight that you fight. And in order to win fights, you need to make sure that you're uh, understanding and analyzing and then taking advantage of your opponent's vulnerabilities. And one of those vulnerabilities, obviously, for an employer is that they can't make profit without a workforce. And so that's the fundamental vulnerability that we recognize in a strike. But more to the question of a timeline, this is true about organizing generally and is true about strikes specifically, is when does the employer need the workforce the most? So is there a critical point in the production process where either a singular group of workers or the most strategically placed can then inspire the rest of the workforce to join them, like highly skilled trades workers, for instance, or if you think of a factory, the maintenance workers who actually fix and maintain the equipment, they may be small in numbers, but they have exponentially greater leverage. And if they were to be joined by workers across other departments, they would have a strategic, ability to disrupt production, whether it's, with certain equipment or whether it's certain, business practices or expectations that the company has that they got to deliver by this date. That they have to have this stage of production completed by this timeline, or that their peak season is coming up at this time, or that they're about to roll out a big, announcement, in a few weeks. So when they need the workforce the most is often the best and most strategic time to have been prepared and then later to execute a strike itself. Um, so there's no fixed timeline under the law that I'm aware of, and I don't think that exists under the National Labor Relations Act. Perhaps under the Railway Labor Act, which I'm not going to speak to tonight, their rights to strike are very different. Under the Railway Labor Act that governs workers, as you may assume, who work in the railroad industry, but also workers in the airline industry, other related crafts. But under the National Labor Relations Act, you can have an open-ended strike. There's no obligation for the employer to concede to meet to bargain at any certain time. What their calculation is, how long can they go without making profit? And just like there, as we heard from some of the leaked information from the AMPTP about the riders, is that they were hoping that riders would starve and lose their homes and be forced to end their strike because of that. Ultimately, that did not work for the studios. Um, but there's no mandate that negotiations had to begin. Real quick, Chrissy, you had mentioned about the threshold under the IATSC's constitution for a 75% supermajority, and I would even say that as we saw with the IATSC's members who were covered by the basic and area standards agreements 2 years ago, that they voted by 90 some plus percent margins. I don't know if it was 98%, but it was an overwhelming statement of unity by IATSC members who were prepared to take that stand against the AMPTP.
Yep.
Ultimately, an agreement was reached. But what we saw with the Teamsters this year is another historic example of being prepared. The largest, private sector collective bargaining agreement in the world. 350,000 plus workers in every part of this country, from major cities and rural areas. That those workers authorized that strike, and like my mama would tell me growing up, don't put your hands up to fight unless you're ready to throw some punches. And I believe those Teamsters were. I believe the IATSC members were. And as a result of their viable, potent, actionable strike threat, They were able to achieve great gains from those employers that ultimately the members have ratified and incorporated into their new agreement. So you shouldn't take a strike authorization vote just to take one. You should take one only if you are sure that you have that supermajority already ready. So the organizing work of assessing one's coworkers through one-on-one outreach, like we teach in our organizing model, is as important at that phase as it is at the very beginning to make sure that when we call a strike authorization vote, the votes are there and that people are not just voting yes for strike authorization as a bargaining tactic, but that they're actually willing to carry it out. That vote is not just a ceremonial, check the list just because you want to say that you want the employers to think you're willing to strike, but that you actually are and you're prepared and you have a plan to win.
Absolutely. Um, XLay X Twitch says that did answer the question. So thanks,
Okay,
Ben.
cool. I tried.
You understand the English language better than I do.
No,
Um,
no. It's complicated stuff.
yeah. Uh, and Stussy 5150 says the AMPTP also wanted IATSE to starve and turn against WGA and SAG. And I wonder if you're not an IA member yourself, but the solidarity between our unions is very strong, and we're here to back each other on the picket lines, as so much of social media showed this past summer. IA was on the pickets with SAG and with the WGA, and I honked many a horn at the picket lines as I was driving around Los Angeles over the summer. So, you know, they underestimate our worker power collectively across unions and not just in our individual unions as well. Oh, you're in Local 600. That's awesome. Yes, a lot of it depends upon what part of the country you're in as to how much solidarity there is. I'll believe that. Um, but maybe we could talk a little bit more about well, not more, but elaborate on the idea of this of planning for a strike, um, and making sure that uh, we're utilizing it in the way that it should be utilized, and making sure that we have as much power as we possibly can if it's coming to that. So what are some ways that most people might not think about organizing a strike that can be really powerful for us to use?
Well, it really starts with those, fundamentally with the organizing conversation itself. I mean, do people feel like what they want on the job is worth fighting for? Why not quit? Why not just accept the way it is? Why not go through the internal individual processes that the company so generously provides? Like you can go to talk to HR or go up to your chain of command. How did those avenues work in addressing your concerns? Can you really resolve collective problems through individual solutions? And what are you willing to do, to address those priorities as an individual and as a group? And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience and careful trust building, and development of a communication network that is led by the workers themselves in a truly representative and complete way. So you can't have a strike without doing the fundamental work of organizing. And that's very important to keep reemphasizing, because there's maybe this um, fallacy. I said maybe, but there is a fallacy that either a strike is an order coming from some union head that's directing all the workforce to go on strike, and the workers are passive subjects of that directive, which doesn't occur because you can't have a strike like that. People wouldn't follow those orders, and they would need to ensure that there is sufficient buy-in and understanding of why that tactic is necessary at this point. Likewise, the other fallacy is that just spontaneously workers say enough is enough without any plan and just walk out. I don't think that that has actually occurred in history. I think workers have been talking in those instances for a long time, and that some incident had just occurred to trigger their action that had actually been planning underground and had been latent for many, many years and months or weeks prior to. Um, so the plan to carry out a strike is how do you win? You're not fighting to fight. You're not fighting to get revenge. You're not fighting to have an emotional venting session. You're not fighting to get support from the community just to make you feel righteous about your struggle. You're fighting to change the working conditions, pay, and benefits on the job, right? So if that's your goal, then a strike is a tool in your toolbox that you should utilize and know that is there, but utilize only when it's necessary. Perhaps you don't need a sledgehammer to get what you need. Perhaps you need a different tool. And the assessment, that risk assessment that workers are making about which tool is necessary, is the job of organizing. But what we have a duty to do as organizers is to present to them all the tools that they have at their disposal and let them understand the power that they need to operate those tools. So you can carry out forms of protected concerted activity that don't require the level of extended commitment and sacrifice that a strike may. And I'd just like to say too, Chrissy, that there's also this belief that strikes are always open-ended. They're always just massive, unknown in nature about when they would start and when they will end. Strikes can also, as you kind of referenced in the walkout question that you had, or point that was made in the chat, strikes can be a lot more targeted too.
Mm-hmm.
I've participated in a few one-day strikes, and you would think that a strike in a singular day would not be powerful enough to disrupt the company's ability to make a profit. But if you're in Atlanta, Georgia, in the middle of the summer, and trash pickup at major corporate and public institutions needs to occur daily, or things start to get a little stinky, then having a strike that starts on a Friday morning and goes to the weekend um, has a certain effect that may not be the same in every industry, but certainly when you have critical services that are being provided, maybe strikes can occur in a very you know restricted period of time that has maximum impact. So
Absolutely.
I mentioned the unfair labor practice strikes. I mentioned economic strikes and the
Mm-hmm.
differences of the employers to deploy strike breakers. There's also a strike for voluntary recognition, and the strike for voluntary recognition is to establish a union. So if there's a belief that the employer will not give us a fair process to win an election, they won't agree to voluntary recognition. They will hire union busting consultants to interrogate us and threaten us and to spy on us. That before there was a National Labor Relations Board election process, workers would just strike to win their union. But strike wasn't in order just to get a contract or because the company is violating the law. It was the means to form the union to begin with. And that to us now seems like a pretty radical step. Like even to form the union, you would cease work. Well, it's one way to really compress that timeline to win a union if a strike is properly planned and carried out. That employers that, well, I'll agree to recognize your union if you just get back to work. And then we can agree to disagree and compromise and negotiate around your first contract. There was a General Motors plant here in Atlanta that a month prior to the Flint sit down strike in Flint, Michigan, was successful in establishing United Auto Workers here in Atlanta, Georgia, at a General Motors plant of the Lakewood General Motors plant from a sit down strike. And instead of leaving the workplace, the workers stayed within the workplace and occupied the workplace until their union was recognized, and they were successful. The community was bringing them food, and people think about the South not being a place to support workers. Well, none of our communities, none of these employers are monolithic. A strike is certainly not monolithic, And we have to look at the particular historical context. And in that historical context, like the teachers in LA and West Virginia, and in some cases, many other strikes that we're seeing, is that there's broad community support, less about the support for strikes. And in some cases, not even about being pro union. It's about caring about those that are actually doing that work and seeing that they have made a decision that has been incredibly tough for them to make, but their loved ones, their friends, their neighbors, and other people in the community support them because they love and care about them as people. And that is an important point to make about expanding the leverage that the workers have in any given workplace far beyond that workplace, to allies who have their backs and can sustain them on a strike. But it's important that those allies, that we all recognize those allies cannot win a strike for the workers who ultimately have the duty of disrupting that production process, because they're the ones that do the work. So you need both.
Yep.
And we have seen that, when you have both and you have the right plan and you've shown restraint, but also embrace the willingness to go on strike when necessary, workers win.
Sure do. Um, Jesse Pills, love and solidarity from this video stage check. Glad to have you here. Uh, I don't know where Doraville is. I'm going to assume that's an Atlanta area thing.
Yep.
Stussy says now the former GM plant in Doraville is assembly stages.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is.
Well, it's been converted to part of the film industry, and yeah, the GM plant in Doraville was really a victim of the free trade policies that were supported by both parties for several decades and even to this day, and has allowed for manufacturing to continue at an exponential pace. And so that was less about that particular plant having a union and more about the ability for capital to seek ever cheaper, more compliant labor throughout the world. What we are seeing is those that plants, auto plants in Mexico and other parts of the world, certainly East Asia, and certainly in Europe, and have organized unions themselves, and are seeking to set standards that meet their workers' needs, and we should all support them. But fundamentally, employers are going to always try to find a group of workers or communities or a labor market that they feel like they can hyper exploit because they have less protections under the law. That's why the textile industry moved to the United States South. That's my family's history of textile mills being opened in the South to escape union organizing in the Northeast, and then a generation later, that those textile mills went to Southeast Asia and throughout the rest of the world. But ultimately, the ability and the willingness of employers to try to replace us with more compliant, more exploitable labor is not about vilifying and making those workers the other, that somehow they don't deserve what we deserve, but by coordinating across borders and creating an international united front of workers who say, whether you're creating or building a GM car or truck here in the United States or somewhere else in the world, we stand together. And that's one thing that we've seen in our game worker organizing, is that as there's been discussions here in the States about organizing with the IATSE and organizing in the game sector, we do know these conversations are happening around the world, and we're reaching out to game worker unions and others in the entertainment industry to help spawn those efforts, and we can coordinate. We're certainly seeing that in visual effects, and we have seen that in animation too. It all goes back to the employer's ultimate tactic of divide and conquer, pitting us against each other.
Yep. Absolutely. I say that a lot. XLayX says Kaiser workers had a weekend strike that alone disrupted some regions in big ways, though it makes me wonder how long they can actually go.
Well, yeah, I think what you hear from healthcare workers is their desire to defend patient safety, and they're on strike in order to ensure that the mission of this healthcare institution is actually fulfilled, that they put people before profit. And so there's a lot of restraint that those healthcare professionals show, that they do not want to put patients in danger, knowing that their healthcare executives are not concerned as much as they are, because they're the ones that interact with those that are in need and their patients. And so the term is intermittent strike, and the number of times that you can do that is also restricted. And but if Kaiser or other companies continue to fail to bargain in good faith, for instance, or engage in any other unfair labor practices, those strikes can continue to occur, and they may be expanded in the number of days of duration that they take place. Um, Again, it's important to apply the sufficient amount of pressure to win, and not anymore.
Yeah.
So, in order to prevail in that, we have to make sure that we, as those that understand the importance of strikes, or maybe even advocating, do not run out ahead of where that supermajority is at. We have to be grounded, and the only way we can be grounded to where that supermajority is actually willing, the risk and the actions they're willing to take, is by having careful one-on-one organizing conversations led by their peers and a representative core group of those peers that can actually talk to every single one of their coworkers.
I think last week we touched on one-on-one conversations a bit with Vimy here, but they really are pivotal to organizing and staying organized with your coworkers. You have these conversations at all points of the process and even beyond. So getting to know your coworkers is really important. And it can be a little scary sometimes because you don't know necessarily who you're talking to or how they feel about things, and it's touching on things that get people excited in positive or negative ways. So it's brave work to do. Um, but if anybody in the chat wants to learn more about that or how they can do that at their workplace, I saw Fractured Falcon typed it in the chat, but you can type !organize or !IATSE and get links to our website or links to contact an organizer, and we can have a conversation about where we can go. AJ Blue Cloud, glad to see you. What if one of the things you want to fight for is a certain percentage of jobs to stay in house, to lower outsourcing? Do you have advice on how to approach that without hurting our peers in other countries with our narrative? That's a great question, AJ. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah. Well, one, by restricting outsourcing, what we're saying is that you have the people here that are already doing the work, that they should be allowed to maintain and continue that work. And what we're not seeking to do by restricting outsourcing is prohibit any future growth of the employer, just so long as it doesn't displace and adversely impact the current workforce. So they can grow, but they shouldn't replace. They shouldn't substitute somebody doing the same work for less, with less rights.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when one group of workers organize, they should, and set those standards around subcontracting or outsourcing. They have a duty of lifting up and supporting the work of workers abroad in those other sectors, to raise their standards up so there's not that competitive advantage of exploiting one group of workers over the other. And I'll just lift up unions like the UAW and others that do support auto workers organizing in Mexico and other parts of the world, and have done exactly that. And the ITSC is part of a organization called Uni Global that works with other entertainment unions around the world. And we can do both. We can protect the current jobs in a particular labor market while also supporting and standing in solidarity with those that are seeking to raise standards in their own. Labor hasn't always got that right, as you know. I'm just sorry, Chris. Labor has not. The labor movement has not got that right. Don't get it. Don't let me confuse anybody or mislead anybody that there has been movements here that have that trade unions and others have got behind that have had more than just a whiff of xenophobia in their promotion of buy American products, for instance. I remember when I first got hired as an organizer, came to a union hall, I was told that if you have a foreign car, you can't park in the parking lot. You have to park on the street
Wow.
because they wanted to support Buy American. And that may have been motivated by wanting, again, to take care of and support and show solidarity for workers who may be your neighbors or coworkers or others that you're connected to. But ultimately, the only way that we can support workers anywhere is by raising standards for workers everywhere.
100%. Um, AJ Blue Cloud is just quoting you in the chat, and I just wanted to say that Ben is a very quotable man. Um,
I hope some
but
of that's
it's a
coherent. Y'all might need a Southern translator on here for me, but thank you.
um, and I love your little dinosaurs, X Twitch. I don't know where those came from, but they're very cute. Um, great. Does anybody in the chat have more questions? Please keep them coming. We are here to help and answer as many as we can. Um, but what do you think, Ben? Is there something I missed? Is there something else we should touch on?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of great material on strikes and how recently, and without dropping names of authors and others, I think people should educate themselves on the history of strikes. Strike strategies. In this country in particular, the history of strikes in this country is an important tradition that we should understand and embrace, and also understand the historic context of those struggles. But there's a reason why they're revered by people in the labor movement, by workers who are participating in it. Again, when they win, and even in some cases when they weren't successful, because something happens to the human consciousness when you're on strike, and like when you're on an organizing campaign, that your individuality, as important as and sacred as it is to who we are, fundamental to who we are. What's also fundamental to who we are is our communion and connection to others, and our need and dependency on others. Particularly when we're engaged in a shared production process, we realize our common interest in a deep physical and emotional way when we're on a picket line with others that may look different than us. But damn it, if we don't have a lot in common. And the sense of unity that is expressed out there in such a, you're outside. You may have the police watching you. You may have employers, supervisors and guards watching, and they're watching a group of people who are walking back and forth, not at home, right? They're actively, if you're on strike, you're working. And many of those, anybody that has ever been on strike knows it's not time off, it's time on. And you have to be, ready to do your duty, to support that action. But it can be beautiful, it can be incredibly exhausting. Um, it can be one of the hardest things and the most empowering things that anybody's ever went through. Um, we went on a strike at a sanitation company, Republic Services in McDonough, Georgia, for a week years ago. And I remember, the first day, the first night, when the some of the commercial drivers, the front end and roll off drivers, brought their trucks back. Some of them never went out, but we started the picket line at like 3 a.m. and in the middle of the night. And so you can see on everybody's faces, despite the darkness, you can feel the tension and the anxiety. Are we about to do this? Are we about to shut this facility down? And then there was a sense of encouragement for one another. Yeah, we can do this. We have a right to do this. We put this off. We have thought about it. We have given the company every opportunity. And the only thing the company understands is one thing. Well, let's say two things. They're both 5 letters: money and power. And until we disrupt their ability to make money and to withhold power, hold power over us, then we're not free. Then we're not going to have the voice that we need to address our concerns. And to see that anxiety start to fade into a place of courage, collective courage. I don't know if that kind of transformation can occur in such a compressed way in through any other means. When we're talking about, the establishment of economic democracy and, liberation in the workplace and society, where people feel like they actually are having a say over their lives for the first time. It's wonderful. But we shouldn't fetishize it like it's the only thing. There you can also experience that same sense of solidarity and unity in all of our work in organizing. And I think people that I know for a fact, people that successfully built a union from scratch by doing one-on-ones and never went on strike, but got that stratospheric level of support of 90% of their coworkers willing to stand up to their employer and vote yes, or throw up a Zoom background, or sign a petition. All of those can, people experience the same, many of the same feelings of that the employer did not want us to do this, but we know we needed to do it, and damn it, we did it, and now we won, and our lives are better. And once those lessons are learned, nobody can take that away from you.
Serious business. So powerful. Um, I hope that if you're in the chat, if you're watching, and you work in games and you want to find your power, hit up gameworkers.org, take our survey that's there, or just reach out to an organizer. If you type organize or IATSE in the chat, it'll give you contact information for who you can reach out to. Sylvette 3D says, Ben is awesome. Sure is. I can't think of anyone better to guide y'all through your unionizing journey. Who are you, Sylvette? You're awesome too. Okay, keep that in mind.
I know who Savette is. Hey, Savette.
Okay. I got Ben fans in the chat. No. And thank you, Kello of Kells. We will go. I hope you come with us. That survey was a lot better than the one the IA just sent out. Thank you. I hope you filled out both, but we worked real hard on it on both sides of that. So anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Ben, I can't thank you enough for being here. The chat loves you. I hope you come back.
Anytime.
Sick. We'll see you next week. I'm just going to hand you the mic. This is your stream now.
Nope.
You can figure out the audio issues every week. But join us next week. We'll be here next week. We are talking about negotiations. Actually, we're going to talk about what we can do for contracts and learning a little bit more about that. So bring your questions to that, and we'll be back here, same time, same place, same channel, same me, maybe same Ben. I don't know. Maybe it'll be a different Ben. I don't know. But have a great week, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye, everybody. See y'all.
Bye, everybody.